let me begin with a confession. I have not always been a Christian. I wasn't born one, and the circumstances that led to my conversion to Christianity, I believe, would best be discussed at another conference. Next, I would like to make a disclaimer. The title of this presentation notwithstanding, I do not speak for Africa. I would make several references to Africa, but I do not speak for the entire continent. It is common on a forum such as this one to conflate one's personal experience with the fortunes and misfortunes of the continent. On several occasions, people would ask me to explain, clarify, or justify events in Africa, ignoring the fact that sometimes I'm just as confused and irked by some of these events. So in this presentation, I would like to focus on Africa through the lens of a personal narrative. And I leave it to you to discern and judge if at all this personal narrative how this personal narrative might intersect with and or shed light on the subject of our conversation, that is, the global call of religious life today. I entered religious life 29 years ago, and I admit, not as long as Sister Pat and Father Beltran. At the time, I had only been a Christian for approximately 3 years. Becoming a Christian presented a trail of challenges, not least for a teenager from Benin City whose spiritual life had been nourished on a sumptuous diet of beliefs and rituals and practices common to indigenous African religion. Yet, the trials of conversion to Catholicism paled compared to those occasioned by my decision to enter religious life. The combination of my background in indigenous African religion and the relatively short span of life as Christian that preceded my entrance into the novitiate of the Jesuits meant that in reality, nothing prepared me for consecrated life. And certainly not the 2-year rite of Christian initiation of adult that I spent mainly committing to memory the entire Baltimore Catechism. Prior to RCIA, I had never met or interacted with a religious. There wasn't, and still there isn't, a word in my mother tongue for religious. Nowadays, we only speak of sister, brother, or father, but not religious. People often ask about my parents' reaction when I decided to enter religious life. Well, my father gave consent without inquiring much into the meaning and purpose of life. As a religious for this impressionable 19-year-old son, had he posed the question, though, I would have been hard-pressed not to make up the answers. I didn't know either, except that the white priest impressed me exceedingly by their compassion for the marginalized, care for the impoverished, and total availability for the needs of people in my neighborhood. I simply wanted to be able to make a difference like those Jesuits. My father's indifference was as surprising as my mother's reaction was predictable. My mother resolutely opposed the idea. For her, quitting college in pursuit of consecrated life was too much a price to pay for a senseless and meaningless career option, if indeed you could call this a career. But that was not the point of contention. It was not the real point of contention. In essence, religious life constituted an assault on the fabric of our religious beliefs and cultural traditions. And it fell to my eldest sister to supply an apt and appropriate metaphor to express our culture's disdain for this thing called religious life. So one day, in the midst of the confusion and the misunderstanding that my decision had sown in the family, my sister confronted me with a pointed question. When? Tell me. When will you come to your senses and take leave of those people who neither lay nor hatch eggs? Those people who neither lay nor hatch eggs. Remember I said we do not have a word in my language for religious. Like any African proverb, her choice of imagery needed no further explication. It was a question loaded with the symbolic portent of the threat of religious life for our cultural and religious heritage. She vividly articulated the senselessness and meaninglessness of religious life within the framework of the religion and culture in my part of Africa. You see, in a culture where life is measured in quantitative and qualitative terms, in its intensity and longevity, fertility and procreation serve as the ultimate rule of communal belonging and moral responsibility. Life unfolds in time and space along an axis of maturation. Every child born into the family has a distinct identity, but remains essentially a minor. That is, some would say, a monad. Now, upon the attainment of adulthood, a man or a woman is expected to contract marriage or become a dyad and begin the onerous task of procreating, becoming a triad, in order to increase quantitatively in number and qualitatively the life force of the family and the community. For us, then, procreation represents the apex of this triple anthropological trajectory of human maturation and fulfillment. Tanzanian theologian Laurenti Magesa appropriately designates the underlying worldview as the moral tradition of abundant life. Accordingly, on the premise of my sister's laconic and symbolic representation, a religious is someone who consciously violates the norms and expectations of our religious beliefs and cultural traditions to prolong, extend, and deepen the collective existence and survival through fertility and procreation. To choose a different vocation for us amounts to a fatal assault on the collective destiny of the community. A more abominable choice would be unimaginable. My experience is not untypical of many an African who opt for a religious life, but let's not generalize. Mine is a personal narrative. In my case, therefore, as an African, the most formidable rebuttal against my vocation to religious life was the fertility argument, as I call it. For my people, if Christianity was decidedly foreign, religious or consecrated life proved a more potent foe. It was a death-dealing negation of the way of life of my people. At this point, let me note a concern. Listening to my narrative so far regarding the perception of religious life in the context of my religious and cultural worldviews, we may be tempted to consider religious life and Africa as strange bedfellows. There are those like my sister who continue to insist on the incompatibility of Africa and religious life, while constantly adducing the fertility argument founded on the logic of procreation. Now, granting the charm somewhat and the vehemence of this argument, we may still probe further the evidence of history to discover and weave a different narrative of religious life on the continent. I mentioned history, and it is important because history tells us that consecrated life owes its origin in part to the continent. There is a corpus of critical and historical documentation that attests to a flourishing desert monasticism in the 3rd and 4th centuries, describing how desert fathers and mothers pioneered monastic life in Christian North Africa. And we see these in the lives of greats like Antony the Great, Pachomius, Macarius the Alexandrian, Amun, Macarius the Egyptian, all of whom are documented in the work, the sayings of the fathers. Since the time of the North African fathers and mothers, religious life, like Christianity, has recorded phenomenal growth on the continent. Now think of it. Who then would have thought or imagined that the once dreaded dark continent, also known as the white man's grave, would become, in the words of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, quote, an immense spiritual lung for a humanity which seems to be in a crisis of faith and hope, end of quote, and the bedrock of the revival and growth of Christianity as a non-Western religion. Now, the current statistics lend credence to a pattern of sustained growth of religious life on the continent. The 2013 Pontifical Yearbook records a growth rate of 18.5% for the group of professed religious who are not priests, more than 28% for the total number of professed religious, and 30.9% for candidates for diocesan and religious priesthood globally. This demographic trend is replicated in Asia against a significant downward trend in parts of Europe, North America, and Oceania. A visit to some African cities like Ibadan, Nigeria, Kinshasa in the DRC, or Nairobi in Kenya offers convincing proof about the fortunes and promises of religious life on the continent. And it is not uncommon for some parts of the city to be designated as Little Vatican on account of the concentration of religious communities of women and men. Now, leaving aside the question of statistics and its implications, what is the meaning or value of religious life in Africa? In other words, how would I respond convincingly to my sister's question? When will you come to your senses and take leave of those people who neither lay nor hatch eggs? How would I respond convincingly? Now, apart from manuals of formation adapted to particular communities, I have to admit that there is a scarcity of sustained and critical study of Catholic religious life on the continent. For example, there is no equivalent of Sandra Schneider's monumental trilogy on Catholic religious life that I am aware of on the continent. And so as I prepared these reflections, I revisited one of the earliest studies of religious life written in Africa by the late Congolese Jesuit priest Matungulu Otene in 1981. Matungulu drew on the fertility argument to demonstrate how religious life was, in theory and practice, a source of fruitfulness, or what he called fecundity, in religious, cultural, and anthropological contexts of life in Africa. Matungulu's short treatise entitled Celibacy and the African Value of Fecundity, or in its French original, Célibat consacré pour une Afrique assoiffée de fécondité. It remains a classic, unparalleled, I would say, by later patchy and somewhat hagiographic accounts of the value and significance and benefit of religious life on the continent. Although Matungulu, in his little book, focused on celibacy, the scope of his reflection encompassed the wide gamut of religious life, including the other two evangelical counsels, poverty and obedience. Matungulu underlined the imperative of what he called Africanization of religious life, and the necessity for religious life to become, quote, deeply rooted in our African soil. End of quote. Now, seemingly confirming my sister's misgivings about religious life, Matungulu considered that, quote, for us, peoples of Black Africa, failure to have children is a great humiliation, a misfortune for which neither material wealth nor moral qualities can compensate. End of quote. Elsewhere, Matungulu declared, quote, all Africans desire to have children, sometimes by any means. End of quote. Now, I believe that this statement overgeneralizes the situation, even though it does contain certain elements of reality and would sound like music to the ears of my sister and my mother. However, Matungulu railed against those who would claim, quote, that it will be practically impossible for Africans to live a life of celibacy. End of quote. Most interestingly, for the narrative with which I began this presentation, and for our focus on Africa, Matungulu turned the fertility argument on its head. Using celibacy as a point of reference, he argued in favor of religious life as what he calls, quote, genuine type of fertility, which is not necessarily biological, end of quote. In fact, he demonstrated that to limit fecundity to biological activity amounts to a banalization of the meaning and purpose of life for an African. And meditating on the life of Jesus Christ as the source, model, and raison d'etre of religious life, and without prejudice to married life, Matungulu affirmed in a language that is evocative of Pope Francis's that, quote, any Christian man or woman who awakens another human being to the life of God in Jesus Christ is spiritually fruitful, end of quote. And so, nourished by faith and self-sacrificing love, religious life is the means par excellence, according to Matungulu, for waking up the world to life. And following the example of Jesus, it is a unique way of, quote, being eternally generative. Being eternally generative, end of quote. Matungulu concluded his treatise on celibacy in Africa by emphasizing the essence of religious life to, quote, awaken somebody else to life. Awaken somebody else to life, end of quote. So, whereas my sister used the fertility argument to discredit religious life for an African like me, Matungulu insisted that lived as a life of prophetic witness, total commitment, and radical discipleship modeled on the example of Jesus of Nazareth, the call to religious life is an inexhaustible living source of life pour une Afrique assoiffée de fécondité. If examples of the fruitfulness of religious life on the continent are needed, we need not look beyond the modern-day icons of religious life that brightly illuminate the African landscape, like slave-turned Saint Bakita of Sudan, Matter of Faith, Blessed Anwarite Nengepeta of DR Congo, and Monk Michael Iwenetansi of Nigeria, just to mention a few. Now we can read their acts of witnessing in a variety of ways. For me, their witnessing reveals the enduring fruitfulness of religious life on the continent today. These are voices not from the past, but prophets for our times. Reflecting on the subject of our conversation, I have wondered whether my sister will be willing to revise her imagery of religious life when confronted with the heroic, productive, transformative, and life-giving ministry of countless religious women and men in Africa. And we have concrete examples of their evangelical fruitfulness in several areas. Let's talk about education. In simple terms, I would contend that the religious educated Africa and continue to do so. Whether we look to the Zalitians, the Maris, the Combonians, and many others, renowned across the continent for their pioneering mission of education, with particular emphasis on the less privileged and at-risk youth, or whether we look to the Notre Dame, the OLAs, the Loreto sisters, who dedicate their lives to a lifelong service of education and empowerment of African girls, oftentimes in the most precarious situations. The evidence of life engendered through the labors of these women and men remains incontestable. As Benedict XVI declared in his apostolic exhortation, Africae Munus, and I quote, "Throughout her history, the Catholic Church has shown particular concern for education. She has always raised awareness among parents, providing them with the encouragement and assistance in carrying out their responsibility as the first educators of their children in life and in faith. In Africa, the church's teaching establishments, her schools, colleges, high schools, professional schools, universities, and so forth, place tools for learning at people's disposal without discrimination on the basis of origin, financial means, or religion. The church makes her own contribution by recognizing and making fruitful the talents that God has placed in the heart of each person. Many religious congregations were founded with this end in view. Countless holy women and men understood that leading people to holiness first entailed promoting their dignity through education. End of quote. Now, for me, Benedict offers an accurate assessment, but he misses the mark by speaking generally of church, where he should be more specific in talking about the schools, colleges, high schools, professional schools, universities, and so forth of religious communities that have contributed to making Africa what it is today. Education. And there is healthcare. Religious nursed Africa and continue to do so. From dispensaries and clinics in remote villages to large hospitals and training schools for nurses in urban settings, religious have been pioneers in attending to the healthcare need of an entire continent. And I should not fail to single out for praise the heroic service of women religious communities in combating AIDS in Eastern Africa. And we could also talk about evangelization. Whether the White Fathers and Holy Ghost Fathers in West Africa, the missionary sisters of Our Lady of Africa in northern Ghana, or the Daughters of Charity, or medical missionaries of Mary, there is little doubt about the role of religious as primary evangelizers on the continent. In the course of a century, therefore, religious communities have labored at the frontiers of evangelization, announcing the good news of liberation, not in words, but in life-affirming deeds of compassion, mercy, and love. And we have had such beautiful and eloquent testimony of that from Sister Pat with her work in South Sudan. Thank you. Well, there is a fourth domain of fruitfulness, which I would, for lack of better term, call integral human development and social transformation. And in light of these, I think, for example, of CNN Heroes Award winner Sister Rosemary Irumbe of St. Monica Tailoring School in Gulu, Uganda, who is creating alternative viable paths to life for teenage girls violated and traumatized by rebel insurgency and government recklessness. I think also of 2013 UN Nansen Refugee Award recipient, Sister Angelique Namaika of DR Congo, whose personal and religious vocation is to rescue, rebuild, and restore the dignity of women who are victims of violence and war. I could multiply the examples, but the truth is, there are many, many unsung heroes in Africa, and I mean religious women and men who labor for the sake of Christ to slake the thirst of the continent for abundant life. Besides this, what you might call heroic accomplishments, communities of consecrated persons have been innovators in other domains, such as liturgical renewal and enculturation. I think, for example, of the Abba Eker Musa monks in Senegal, who are famous for their composition of sacred liturgical chants using indigenous psalmody set to hunting tunes strummed on the kora. The Benedictine monastery in Midwestern Nigeria is famous for pioneering alternative medicine using organic herbs, backs, bushes, and seeds, as are many religious communities in Eastern Africa whose lifestyle, in fact, is a case study in environmental integrity and ecological sustainability. Now, I want to add that in enumerating and highlighting these signs of livingness and fruitfulness of religious life on the continent, we should not overlook some real challenges with consecrated life on the continent. There are challenges. One thorny issue to begin with, and it's not peculiar to the continent, is the relationship between ecclesiastical authorities and religious communities. I suppose you catch my drift. A relationship fraught with tension and controversy in several instances. In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa that I am familiar with, the provisions of Mutuae Relaciones of 1978 that Vatican document formulated to guarantee harmonious relationship, cooperation, collaboration, and understanding between bishops and religious communities is at best unknown to many, and at worst, a dead letter. The exercise of power and the limitations imposed on the freedom of religious communities by some local ordinaries violates the provisions of mutuo relationes. And there are examples of the exercise of power by local ordinaries in regards to religious communities that border on abuse, victimization, and violation, exploitation. Here is a recorded testimony of a superior of a women's congregation in West Africa, and I quote, "The attitude and behavior of ecclesiastical leaders toward women religious is often both oppressive and contemptuous. There are cases of outright appropriation of the properties of the congregations of women religious. In their subordination to the clergy dictate terms and expect unquestioning compliance. Due to their quest for economic control, incompetent priests are appointed hospital secretaries, school administrators, and bursars in diocesan apostolic institutes run by and or belonging to women religious. Priests are gradually abandoning the task of preaching the word to take over the ministries of women religious. In addition, their lack of education for justice have made women religious a source of cheap labor for the clergy and glorified housekeepers." End of quote. That's on the side of mutual relationships. What about recruitment and formation for religious life? I see here another area of concern. It is a commonly held belief that Africa, unlike North America, for example, or parts of Europe, as I just said, is enjoying a vocation boom. Yet, questions must be asked about the quality of formation available to new recruits. Judging from my experience, I am convinced that more could be and should be done to enhance the formation of religious in Africa. And I dare say, especially women religious in communities of diocesan rite. Those whom I am familiar with struggle perpetually to generate adequate resources for the formation of their members. Consequently, oftentimes, they become prey and vulnerable to exploitation within and outside the church. Far too many communities, I believe, far too many communities of religious women remain dependent on male congregations or clergy for formation, spiritual accompaniment, and sacramental support. There is a clear need here that I see to explore a different, mutually balanced, and more liberating arrangement. Another area of concern is the foundation and sustainability of religious communities. Without intending at all to be facetious, it would seem that a favorite pastime of some African bishops and priests is to found congregations, especially congregations of women. Looking at the proliferation of priests and bishop-founded communities, We need to question the motivation, the purposes, and sustainability of these groups. On evidence, it is not uncommon for such congregations to become totally subservient to the whims and caprices of the founding father. In some worst case situations, some communities have disintegrated, descended into complete chaos. Sometimes upon the death of the father founder. And I would rather not mention names. Fertility and fruitfulness aside, the other markers of religious life pose serious question to its understanding and practice on the continent. Take poverty, for example. On a continent reputed to be the poorest in the world, how do we conceptualize, preach, and practice the evangelical counsel of poverty? On a continent where authoritarian, dictatorial, and entrenched leadership abound, how does the evangelical life of obedience serve as a prophetic witness of apostolic discernment, freedom, and availability? I do not have answers to these questions or concerns. I don't. And they are not mere academic considerations. The changing context of mission and ministry, notably increased access to connectivity and networking facilitated by information communication technology, social media, globalization, and incipient evidence of secularization, offer new platforms for raising questions about the relevance or attraction or the lack thereof of consecrated life to Africa's youth, now officially recorded as half the total population of the continent. What I'm saying is, regardless of phenomenal progress, we may not evade lingering questions about the value, the quality, and authenticity of the manner of living religious life in Africa. To what extent is it truly liberating and fulfilling? Now back to my sister. 30 years and counting, she still considers me a sterile animal. Opting for religious life in a context that places a high moral, cultural, and religious premium on the propagation and extension of our shared life is considered self-inflicted harm akin to self-immolation. For her, I am simply killing myself and the community for being a religious. But I take consolation in the awareness that there are many of us African religious, and that today, although limited by functional and theological illiteracy, my mother has come to understand fruitfulness as a large concept. Fruitfulness as a large concept that is an integral experience that encompasses faith in one's calling, the fulfillment of a rich vocation, apostolic creativity, human relationships, as well as a commitment to making a difference in our world and the gift of oneself for the sake of another. Rather than constituting the obstacle that my sister decries, I believe that religious life remains a fundamental source of fulfillment for countless women and men who have heeded the call, as Pope Francis has put it, to wake up the world with joy, especially the poor and the weak, by giving them hope, love, and life. Africa's story reminds us that the primary meaning of religious life or consecrated life resides in the noun life. Stripped of this noun, religious loses its meaning. Life is a noun, not the adjective. On a continent thirsting for and often denied abundant life, religious consecration opens a productive and fruitful path to fulfilling the mission of Jesus of Nazareth, that all may have life and have it more abundantly. And to my sister, I would say, guess who's smiling now? Thank you.